Good morning, everyone, and welcome to lesson 6, the final lesson of this course. This can happen, titled "And Then." Okay, so we had a long journey together discussing different aspects of Moshiach. We've discussed the why of Moshiach. Why is this so important? How this is the ultimate purpose of creation. We spoke last week of how is it going to play out. We spoke about Elijah the prophet. We spoke about who Moshiach is, right? We identify some of the qualities, the resume of Moshiach. And today we're going to discuss what will life be like in the era of Moshiach. The era of Moshiach, what is life going to be? Is it going to be the same as we have it today? We wake up in the morning, we go to work, we come home, or is it going to be a whole different reality? What is this reality going to look like? We're striving for this. We are waiting for the time of Mashiach. Well, what are we waiting for? Some of us perhaps are, we say we're dreaming for, the era of Mashiach. Well, how does that dream play out in your mind? What does it look like? Do you have the same clothing? Do you have the same features in your face? Do you act the same way with other people? Well, what's going to be in the era of Mashiach? And this is what we're going to discuss over the next hour this morning. Okay, so this class is a little bit of a different style than the other classes. In that this class is almost like a fascinating facts type of class. It's a lot of information, and we're going to just talk about some of the ideas, the prophecies that the Torah tells us what is going to be when Mashiach comes. So we'll go through many different ideas. Well, maybe if we have time, we'll go through maybe 8 different ideas. We'll talk about the general idea of some of the prophecies interpreted as a natural redemption. We'll talk about some of the lion will lie with the sheep and things like that. We'll talk about the Jewish-Gentile relationships going on in the era of Mashiach. We'll talk about building the temple on Temple Mount. We'll talk about the ingathering of the exiles. We'll talk about the Sanhedrin, the Supreme Court of Jewish law. We'll talk about the war of Armageddon. We'll talk about some of the physical blessings that we have in the prophecies. We'll talk about the resurrection of the dead. We'll try to go through them. Hopefully we'll cover all of them, albeit briefly. And these are some of the ideas of what's going to be when Moshiach comes. Yogi Berra famously said, it's hard to make predictions, especially about the future. Right? You listen to the weather, the meteorologists, right? They talk about tomorrow's going to be this weather, and 2 days it's going to be raining. How often do they get it right? How often do they get it wrong? We all know here with the hurricane seasons that we lived through and that we're living through now, right? We always have these major predictions, and we've got so much better over the years, but we still haven't achieved perfection, right? We still have make errors, and all the time we are evacuating cities that the hurricane never actually hits, and it hits the nearby city, right? Or it doesn't hit at all. So it's very hard to predict the future. But in this area, we have what the Torah tells us. The Torah does tell us a little bit of what the future is going to look like. It's prophecies from God. But at the same time, even in the Torah, we don't have the entire storyline. It's like a movie trailer. We have just a general idea of what it's about. We don't know the exact storyline. We don't know how the plot ends, but we know enough that we know we want to watch the movie, right? We know enough that, I think I want Mashiach. I heard enough. You don't have to tell me anymore, right? So we have a little bit, some bits and pieces, what the Torah tells us about what life will be like at the era of Moshiach. So let's get started. As always, if you have any questions or comments, please share it with us. So we'll start in your textbooks on page 248. We're in lesson 6. I'm going to change the order of text 1. I'm going to read text 1b first, and then we'll go back to text 1a. So text 1b is from Isaiah chapter 11, somewhat of a famous prophecy of Isaiah talking about the end of days, or talking about the time of Moshiach. Text 1b. The wolf will dwell with the lamb. The leopard will lie down with the young goat. The calf and the yearling will be with the lion, and a little child will lead them all. Wow. Beautiful. Amazing. You have a lion, you have a wolf, which naturally they are predators. Naturally, they want to tear apart. You watch National Geographic, you see what happens in the wild, where wild animals like lions and tigers and things like that, they come and they devour cattle, they devour sheep, they devour goats, they devour camel or zebras or deer, right? They don't live side by side in peace. And Isaiah tells us, no, at the time of Moshiach is going to be a whole different era. The nature of the animals are going to change. The lion and the leopard will lie down with the young goat. The wolf will dwell with the lamb in peace, in harmony. That seems miraculous, right? It's going to be a miraculous time. Things are going to change. Okay, that's text 1b. Now, we can't just take that and move on. We got to qualify that. Let's see how Maimonides talks about the end of days, the era of Mashiach. We're going to go back to text 1a. Text 1a from Maimonides. Do not presume that in the Messianic age, any facet of the world's nature will change, or that there will be innovations in the work of creation. The world will continue according to its pattern. And similarly, Maimonides writes that Moshiach himself will not have to prove himself with any type of miraculous actions. The world continues according to its pattern. No major changes. Now, just to explain what Maimonides is saying, we know that I think we all understand there are two types of miracles in our lives, right? Just imagine this scenario. There is an elderly woman who's walking down the street, down here on West Esplanade, with a little purse hanging from her shoulder. And someone comes with a long knife and sticks it to her throat to say, money or your life. And then suddenly, a baseball from the nearby backyard where two children are playing comes flying and knocks the mugger in the face and knocks him to the ground. Is that a miracle? Would you say that's a miracle? If that happened to you, if that happened to your mother, you will come home and say, what a miracle. This guy was about to either kill my grandmother or rob her from her money. And at that exact moment, a baseball, a stray ball came flying and knocked him down. It's a miracle. Now, another scenario, the exact same scenario, the mugger's there with the knife, the woman's there with her purse, and as he's about to stab this person, suddenly this mugger turns into a pillar of salt. Like that. Is that a miracle? Of course that's a miracle. What's the difference? The one miracle defies nature. One miracle defies probability. It's not probable to say that at that moment a ball will come and knock them over. But did it defy any laws of nature? No, it's possible. It could happen. No laws of physics were broken, no laws of nature, right? It's not likely that at that moment this will happen. So it's an amazing miracle, but it didn't defy nature. If a person turns into a pillar of salt, that defies nature, right? So what Maimonides is saying over here is that when we believe in the coming of Mashiach, that there will be miracles, it means miracles of things that are improbable. They're not predictable. They're not the norm. So there will be some type of miracles. We're going to be living a life very, very different to what we're living today, but they're not necessarily going to break the laws of nature. That is what Maimonides is saying in text 1a, right? Now, at the same time, we do have to understand how could we reconcile Maimonides 1a with Isaiah in 1b? Because ultimately, for a wolf to dwell with the lamb is kind of changing the laws of nature, because it's very unnatural for a wolf to lie with a lamb, for a leopard to lie with a young goat. So how does Maimonides interpret the prophecy of Isaiah in text 1b? So let's look at text 1c. Maimonides is aware of this verse, and he explains, he gives his interpretation. He says, don't take it literally. This is a prophecy, and not necessarily is it to be understood literally. Let's read this inside in text 1c on page 249. This is from Maimonides. The wolf will dwell with the lamb. The leopard will lie down with the young goat. These words are an allegory and a parable. The interpretation of the prophecy is that the Jews will dwell at peace together with those wicked Gentiles who had sought to devour them like a wolf and a leopard. They will no longer steal or destroy, but live in peace with Israel. Similarly, other Messianic prophecies of this kind are allegories. Only in the Messianic era will we understand their true meaning. So Maimonides tells us he doesn't necessarily have an interpretation for each and every prophecy. However, he says generally all these prophecies are to be understood as an allegory, and they're not necessarily literal. So, for example, he gives one explanation. What does it mean that you have a lamb, you have a sheep, you have a goat who lives with a wolf and a leopard? He says the wolf and the leopard are referring to the haters of Israel, those nations of the Gentiles who always wanted to devour Israel. And those nations will lie together with Israel, meaning they will be changed. Imagine that. Imagine instead of having wars with Hamas every other day, we're living together in peace. Not because we have this agreement, we have to, but our enemies will want to live in peace with us. Their whole attitude will change, just like the leopard in the parable. Well, her attitude will change to the goat. So too, our enemies, their attitude will change, and we'll live in peace side by side. You know, they say the story of an anti-Semitic walks into a bar, and he sees right there, in one of the front tables, he sees a person who looks clearly like a Jew, wearing a yarmulke, has a payas, has the tzitzis. A Jew is sitting there, and he does not like that. The Jew is sitting there amongst all the Gentiles. And so he goes to the bartender. He says, listen, he says out loud, he says, drinks on the house for everyone sitting here in the bar except for this Jew. That's what he says. And the Jew smiles and says, thank you. Oh, the anti-Semitic does not like that. A few minutes later, he goes back to the bartender. He says, okay, second drinks on the house for everyone but this Jew. He really wants to get the Jew mad. And the Jew smiles again and says, thank you so much. I greatly appreciate it. So he turns to the Jew and says, Jew, are you a sugar? Are you crazy? Why are you thanking me when I am clearly putting you down and offering everyone drinks except for you? The Jew replies, says, I own this bar. Okay. But the point is that Maimonides says that all of the enemies of the Jewish people will live in peace together. So this is the way he interprets these prophecies. Now, by the way, it's important to mention that later on in an epistle, in a letter that Maimonides wrote to clarify his position with all these prophecies, because there was some type of controversy, he writes that not necessarily are they parables, are they allegories. It is possible that they will be miraculous, but he just says that it's not necessary, meaning if you want to interpret it as a parable, there's a lot of place to do that. It is correct to say so. At the same time, we don't know exactly what's going to be, but if it's not a necessity to say it will be miraculous, you could comfortably interpret these prophecies as these other type of miracles that improbable, but not necessarily is it literal, and perhaps they are parables where it's referring to the other nations of the world will live in peace together with the Jews. So that is point number one. Point number two, like I said, we're going to go through a lot of different points over here to get a little bit of a better picture of what life will be like in the coming of Moshiach. Text number 2, Maimonides also continues and talks about another area that perhaps is also not necessarily miraculous change, but a very interesting change and something that will happen, that will develop in the coming of Moshiach. Text number 2 talks about the end of the subjugation of other nations over Israel, over the Jewish people. Text 2. Our sages taught in the Talmud there will be no difference between the current age and the Messianic era, except the emancipation from our subjugation to the Gentile governments. Think of that. Today we are blessed to have Israel protecting the lives of millions of Jews in the Holy Land. We just experienced this last week, right? There were missiles being rained upon the Israeli citizens, and thank God Israel was protecting them. Now, at the same time, we know that Israel, although it's an independent state for the most part, at the end of the day, we know that we depend heavily on other nations, especially the world superpowers. Ultimately, right, even you can look at the last round. Was Israel pressured for a ceasefire? I'm not an expert. I'm not sure, all the information on the ground. But many times Israel will say, you know what? Our allies, our supporters pressured us, which means ultimately we are subjugated to other nations. And of course, obviously, many Jews are not even living in Israel, right? So when we say that the Jews will be free from non-Jewish rulers in the Messianic era, we mean completely free of any influence. We are completely independent. And what do we do when we're independent? We spread light and kindness throughout the world. So this is another prophecy that the Maimonides tells us that what's going to be when Mashiach comes, we're not going to have to justify ourselves. Israel has a right to defend itself. If you're saying that, if you have to justify it, that means you have to answer to other people and explain your actions. You don't have to explain anything. We are who we are. We are an independent, completely unsubjugated to any other nation, fully our own autonomy. That is what's going to be when Mashiach comes. And like we mentioned, we're not going to have any wars because we're going to be living in peace with all of our nations and all of our neighbors. Okay, so we're starting to get somewhat of a picture of what life will be like. Perhaps it will be miraculous, perhaps it won't. But one thing for sure, there will be peace. Peace in Israel, peace in the Middle East, right? That's almost impossible. It's not probable, but that's miraculous, right? Because that's not probable, but it's possible. How will this play out? The attitude of our nations, of our enemies, will change. We're not going to subjugate them. We're not going to overpower them. They will be willing and happy and honored to have this peaceful relationship with us. This is the prophecy. This is the Jewish belief system. Okay, let's move on to the third point. And again, any questions or comments, please share with us. The third idea that we're going to discuss is the building of the temple. Building of the temple. So let's read this in text 3. Maimonides enumerates over here 4 things that Mashiach will do. We'll discuss 3 out of the 4. Text 3, page 251. The Messianic king will arise and renew the Davidic dynasty, restoring it to its initial sovereignty. He will build a temple, gather the dispersed of Israel, And in his days, the observance of all the statutes will return to their previous state. So he writes over here, renew the Davidic dynasty, build the temple, gather the dispersed of Israel, and restore the mitzvahs to its previous state. So the first one about the Davidic dynasty, we mentioned last week already, how Moshiach will be a descendant of King David, and he will restore the Davidic dynasty, which is a discussion for last week. Well, today we're going to discuss building the temple, the gathering, and the observance returning to its original state. Let's start with the building of the temple. So we know we have a belief in Judaism that we will return to Israel and rebuild what we refer to as the third temple. We know that there were many different temples and tabernacles, temporary temples throughout Jewish history. Once King Solomon built the first temple in Jerusalem on the Temple Mount, it's a lot in the news these days, lots of controversy with the Temple Mount today, but built the Temple Mount, the temple in Temple Mount, it became permanent. It lasted for 410 years. It was destroyed by the Babylonians. 70 years later, Ezra has a return to Israel and they rebuild the temple. They build temple number 2 on the exact same location, on the same mountain. Temple, the base Hamikdash, as we refer to it as in Hebrew, the second temple was built on that same building, on the same piece of land, on the same mountain, and that lasted for 420 years. It was destroyed by the Romans in the year 67. And then we believe that Moshiach will come and he will rebuild the temple, meaning he will build a third temple on that same location on the Temple Mount. This is a belief that we mention a lot in our prayers. We talk about the rebuilding of the temple. We even have, if you look on page 252, an ancient Haggadah from 1730 that has a picture of the Temple Mount and this temple on it. The temple that is portrayed over here is not exactly the way it's going to be, but this is a general idea. We always believe that there will be a temple one day on this Temple Mount. I want to show a little video, a little bit about this building, this temple. It was a nice big building. It was very different than the synagogue because we didn't have prayers as we have today. We had a lot of different offerings, but the Torah describes exactly how this temple should look like. And I want to show a little video that gives you a general overview of this temple.
God told the Jews at Sinai to build a temple so that his presence could dwell among them, a place to worship, to gather as a nation, to receive atonement, inspiration, and instruction. Half a millennia later, God's desired location for a permanent home was revealed to King David in the ancient city of Jerusalem, atop a hillside known for Abrahamic times as Mount Moriah. David's son, King Solomon, completed a magnificent structure that attracted the title Beit HaMikdash and Beit HaPirah. It was fashioned with much gold, expensive woods, and precious materials. When it was completed in 827 BCE, the nation gathered to witness God's presence fill the temple. The mountain gained a new name, Har Habayit. At its summit, a stone building rose to enormous height. Within its gaping entrance was the Ulam, a lobby, beyond which was the Kodesh, furnished with 3 golden items, an altar for incense, a 7-branched menorah, and a table with racks for the showbread. At the sanctuary's far end, a separated area enclosed the temple's core, its most sacred location, the Kodesh HaKodashim, that held the Oron, the Ark of God, containing the tablets that Moses delivered at Sinai. The Ark of God rested upon a naturally protruding plateau known as the Foundation Rock. Immediately outside the building, the courtyard of the Kohanim, priests, held a massive stone sacrificial altar with a lengthy access ramp. Nearby was the Kior, a cistern for rinsing hands and feet, and a platform for the Levites to chant psalms and play instruments. Further back, a larger area was designed for public assembly, known as the Woman's Courtyard. It included an extensive wooden balcony for women. The nation would gather 3 times each year to celebrate the festivals of Pesach, Shavuot, and Sukkot. The compound was surrounded by a massive wall and contained a series of steps, numerous gateways and guard posts. The temple's layout was exceptionally efficient, with compartments and chambers for every possible need, such as storage areas for wood, oil, and other materials, production and preparation areas, rooms for clothing, for weaponry in case of attack, ritual immersion pools, sleeping and eating areas, tool and instrument reserves, lockers for the priests, a charity room, a hall for Torah study, a chamber for the Sanhedrin, a lounge for temple officials, a repair workshop, animal holdings, ticket stations, and so on. There were separate entrances for distinct purposes, an oversight system, and honor guards. A small stream ran beneath the temple, which was used to maintain cleanliness. The temple stood for 4 centuries. It was destroyed by the Babylonian army in 423 BCE, rebuilt in 349 BCE, and stood for 4 centuries more until it was destroyed by the Romans in 69 of the Common Era. Through his prophets, God promised the Jews a 3rd and eternal temple in the Messianic Era, from which his presence will spread to the world, embracing all of humanity.
Okay, so there you have it, a little bit of an overview of how this temple looked and what was its function. Although it was a lot of different, service that was done in the temple, but as we mentioned, it was a very holy place. It was a place where, when we had this pilgrimage 3 times a year, the Jewish people will come from throughout Israel and the diaspora, come to spend the holiday near the temple. We said that in addition to being there, they actually witnessed godliness. They saw miracles. They felt very much part of the Shekhinah, of God's energy, the God's the light of God. And it was a place that inspired them. It was very much a place of inspiration. And this will be returned, rebuilt when Moshiach comes. Now, we know we're not living on the clouds. We know that today the Temple Mount is occupied with other structures over there. We have, for those of you who have been to Israel, there is the Western Wall, which was the wall of the supporting wall to the mountain. And then we have a platform over there. We have an area where we could pray. But behind the Western Wall is where the Temple Mount is, and there are different mosques over there. And although somewhat you could say it's under the Israeli jurisdiction, but there's also the Waqf and Jordanians and whatever. There's all the politics over there, exactly who takes control. But obviously we know that there isn't a Jewish temple over there. And the way things are going now, there's no way in the world that Jewish people could come up there one day and say, hey, we're going to destroy all these other mosques and we're going to build a temple. It makes 0 sense in the reality that we're living in today. And in no in near future, we don't see how in the future this could really change. In fact, perhaps some of you remember that in 2018, the U.S. ambassador to Israel, David Friedman, was caught. He was underwater because someone took a photo of him, where they gave him a picture of the old city of Israel, of Jerusalem, and they cut out the mosque, and they put a picture of the temple, of the Jewish temple, on the Temple Mount in Jerusalem. And David Friedman, who was an ambassador of the U.S. to Israel, was caught behind the picture. He wasn't holding the picture. He didn't even know about the picture, but it looked like he was holding the picture, and he had to apologize and say, "Oh, this is terrible. I never would do this." And I apologize, status quo, leaving the status quo on Temple Mount. Which, as a politician, I think he did the right thing. But at the same time, for us Jews, it's not a matter of like, how will the Islamic world ever allow the Jewish people to build a temple? Our belief in Moshiach is that the whole world's attitude is going to change. It's not about let's sit down and strike a deal. Let's start discussions. Let's work things out. That's not the path that we're taking. We're not waiting for them to agree that we should do anything. We believe that the era will come that all nations of the world will want to build a Jewish temple. It's not about the Jewish people want this, the other nations want this. Let's work this out. Can we find a compromise? Let's find common ground. That's what we do today, and that's important to do today. But our belief in Moshiach is that we're not going to need to do that. Because on the contrary, we believe, again, this is somewhat miraculous. This is what Maimonides says. Same way we can't fathom today how a wolf could sit with a lamb, we can't fathom today how other nations will be willing and asking us, please build your temple. But that is the miracles of Mashiach, that all nations of the world will want and encourage the Jewish people to build a temple on the Temple Mount. In fact, we are told that even in temple times, in ancient times, 2,000 years ago when the temple was there, the temple wasn't only for the Jewish people. It protected all humanity, Jewish and non-Jewish alike. It brought atonement for everyone's sins, not only Jewish people. So the problem was that the non-Jewish people at the time didn't recognize this. But if they had recognized this, they wouldn't have destroyed the temple. In fact, there's a midrash that tells us that when we cry over the destruction of the temple, so the verse uses in Lamentations in Eicha, Bachai Sivka, which is like a redundant language of crying, we are crying. And the midrash tells us that the Jewish people are crying and other nations of the world are crying because they regret, said, hey, that was so foolish. We destroyed the temple that was protecting us as well. Why would we do that? I want to read text 4, a very fascinating and a powerful text on page 253. It reads as follows. If the nations of the world knew how beneficial the holy temple was for them, they would have surrounded it with fortifications in order to guard it. So, right, they did not appreciate the temple. But our belief is that they will appreciate the temple when Mashiach comes. Sometimes, even us as Jews, we kind of, the exile mentality kind of influences us, and we start asking questions. Really, how is this possible? How are the Jewish people going to build a temple on the Temple Mount? Yeah, because we get so used to our reality today, but we realize that it's going to be a whole different reality. It's just going to happen. That is our belief. So we don't have to be provocative, because it's not going to help. There's no point of it. Because when the time comes, maybe speedily in our days, when the time comes, it will happen on its own. The other people will just have changed their attitude. And sometimes we have it with ourselves as well. Sometimes we have, for some reasons, we have some type of animosity, we have some type of negative attitude to a certain person. And sometimes we ask ourselves, why? I'm not even sure why. Like, why am I always bothering this person? Why am I not happy when this person is being successful? And sometimes we can't even pinpoint to the cause of it. For some reason, I just have this relationship with this person where I'm just not happy with this person. I'm not happy when this person's around me. I'm right? Especially with children have it sometimes, where one child is picking on the other child and they don't even know why they do it. Some type of subconscious thing where they can't pinpoint. And then one day, sometimes it just changes. The whole attitude changes. And you say, hey, like, what do I see now that I didn't see yesterday? And we don't necessarily even know, but suddenly our attitude changes. And that's true with the nations of the world and the Jewish people. The whole attitude will change. They might not even know why and how, but that's what's going to happen. And that is something interesting, where we see also in text 5 just to read the last paragraph of text 5 from Isaiah as well. Many people shall go, and they shall say, referring to going to the temple, come, let us go up to God's mountain, to the house of God of Jacob, and let him teach us of his ways, and he will go, and we will go in his path. So all the nations of the world will want to make a pilgrimage, will want to come up to the temple, which is interesting. Which just a side parenthetic idea that in Jewish belief, we believe that in the Messianic era, there will not only be Jews, but other nations of the world will also exist. We're not going to have all people converting to Judaism. No, this is in sync with what Judaism always believes, that there's no reason. We don't proselytize. We don't encourage conversion, because we believe that every person was endowed with a specific mission, and there's value, equal value to every person's life and every person's mission. Someone who was born Jewish has the Jewish mission, submission, and then someone who was not born Jewish has their unique mission, and one is not better than the other, and therefore no reason to convert, because you have your important mission. Of course, we accept, we welcome converts all the time, of course, but we don't push for conversion. We don't try to encourage. We don't proselytize, and that is also carries over to the Messianic era, where even in the Messianic era, we say there will be Jews and there will be many non-Jews. Many non-Jews will appreciate the Jews and will appreciate the Jewish temple, etc., but there will be non-Jews and they will be living side by side in peace. So that is point number 3 about building the temple. We still got point 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. Okay? Let's see how much of it we could cover today. So let's move on to point 4, unless we have any questions or comments. Okay. Point number 4. Like Maimonides mentioned earlier, the ingathering of the exiles. So another thing that's going to happen is that Jewish people who are dispersed throughout the planet, right? In Timbuktu, they are in all over the world. Wherever there's Coca-Cola, there's a Jew, right? So all the Jewish people, the exiles, everyone will return to Israel. Something interesting to point out, that Maimonides put the order that first there will be a Moshiach. He'll build a temple, and then there'll be the ingathering. And some say it's precise that first there'll be a Moshiach, and first there'll be the Temple Mount. So first of all, for example, in 1948, with the establishment of the Jewish state, there were thousands or hundreds of thousands over the first few years of the establishment of the state, but there was, people called it the ingathering of the exiles. People from Europe, people from the Middle East, from a lot of the Muslim countries, the people from Africa. I mean, people came by the thousands, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of Jews made a pilgrimage, made an aliyah. They traveled to Israel, and many people were saying, "Look, it's the beginning of the Messianic era. We have the Jewish people coming back to Israel." Based on Maimonides, that seems to be a great idea. It's a great thing for the Jewish people, but not necessarily the beginning of the Messianic era, because Mashiach has to reveal himself first. It's the Mashiach that first reveals himself, and then we have the ingathering. In fact, some say that Maimonides is telling us that even the Mashiach will even build the temple before the ingathering, which means not just that it will happen once we have a temple in Jerusalem, then people will move to Israel, but it's also the motivation. What is the cause? What is inspiring people to move to Israel? Is it because they are fleeing persecution, which, thank God, we have a safe haven in Israel, because they're fleeing persecution, or because they recognize the beauty of the temple, of the godliness that's in Israel? That is the reason why they're traveling to Israel. So it seems like the Maimonides is implying that's the latter, that the gathering of the exiles is not because, hey, you're living in such a terrible place, here, come to Israel, be safer for you, but it's because you recognize the beauty of Israel, the divinity of Israel, the divinity of the temple, and that is the reason why the person is moving to Israel, and that is the ultimate idea of the ingathering of the Jewish people. There are 10 tribes. We know the historic idea that the 10 tribes of Jewish people that will be lost, And we understand that even some of these, or at least representatives of these 10 tribes, will also return to Israel. So we will once again have all of the 12 tribes in Israel. That's point number 4. Point number 5. And there's a lot of information, but the idea is we want to kind of get a better picture of what life will be in the time of Moshiach. So we know already. We know that there will be peace. We will live side by side with our enemies. We won't have enemies. We'll have this temple in Jerusalem where even the non-Jewish people will be flocking to this temple. We know that all the Jewish people from around the world will all be settled in Israel. We know that Israel will expand its borders and will have a place for everyone to live in there, right? We know that we'll have, number 5, this Sanhedrin will be reinstated and will be restored. The Sanhedrin is the main body the judicial system, the highest court of the Jewish judicial system. It's like the supreme Sanhedrin that convened at the temple. Historically, even after the temple was destroyed, it still existed for another few hundred years, but eventually it dissipated and or was disbanded. And basically, the problem with not having a Sanhedrin is that there are many mitzvos, many commandments that we cannot fulfill without a Sanhedrin. Many mitzvos today, although there are 613 commandments, but we only can fulfill roughly maybe less than 100 of them. Most of them apply to Israel, they apply to the temple, they apply to the Kohens, the king. I mean, we're not in that circumstance to fulfill these mitzvahs. So with the coming of Moshiach and with the restoration of the Sanhedrin, we will once again have the opportunity to fulfill many of these commandments, or all the mitzvahs. So we will once again be able to fulfill all the mitzvahs. One major change in lifestyle that this will cause is the calendar. Not to go into great detail now, but perhaps some of you are familiar with the Jewish calendar. Is a lunar calendar, and some months are 29 days, some months are 30 days. But historically, this Jewish calendar is only about maybe 16 or 1700 years old. Up until that point, the Jewish people counted by the moon, but every month they decided whether it was 29 and 20 or 30 days. If they saw the new moon, they went to the Sanhedrin in Jerusalem and they said, hey, we saw the new moon. Then it will be a 29-day month, and that night will be the first of the new month. If they did not see the new moon, then it will be a 30-day month, and the next day will be the first day. What's the major lifestyle change? You can't plan ahead. You can't just look at the calendar. Okay, when's my son's bar mitzvah? You can't know that. Well, you don't know what day it's going to be, right? It's going to be today, tomorrow, right? The whole calendar goes by month. It's month by month basis. When is Rosh Hashanah this year? I don't know. Well, we'll find out when the moon appears, right? How do I make plans? It's very difficult. Well, that is what's going to be when Moshiach comes. That the Sanhedrin are going to once again restore the idea of sanctifying the moon by sight and do away with the Jewish calendar. And that is the way we are going to be living in the time of Moshiach. Just an interesting, trivial information. Okay. We'll go to the 6th point. The 6th idea that what's going to happen, there's this concept of the Armageddon. What's the Armageddon? Some people call it the apocalypse. What is this? What do these words mean? Some of you perhaps have heard of it, perhaps have not heard of it. Basically, the Armageddon is a Greek word, and it's referring to Mount Megiddo. It is presented in Christian sources as the location of a final battle in the end of days, with Christianity coming up on top. Christian sources also call this the apocalypse, a Greek word for prophecy about the suffering of the end of days. So these are where these words come from. Now, it is well known that many Christian ideas actually have a source in Judaism. So there is this idea, Zechariah the prophet does talk about that there will be this great mourning in Jerusalem due to a war, and he compares it to the mourning that once occurred in a previous incident in the valley of Megiddo. which is a location in Israel, a different location. So perhaps that's where this Christian idea of Armageddon comes from. Now, there is this prophecy about some type of war that's going to happen at the end of days. We refer to it in Hebrew as the war of Gog and Magog. Gog is understood to be the name of a king, and the people or the nation is Magog. It's very unclear, even in Jewish sources, exactly what, when, how this war will play out. Maimonides writes that we don't know a lot about this war, so if whatever happens, happens. We're not anticipating this war. Will it actually play out? Interesting that the Rabbi Shimon writes that based on his interpretation in certain verses in Psalms, he writes that King David seems to imply that it's more it's more important for us to be worried or to take our time to think about the education of our children than it is to think about this war of Gog and Magog. In other words, maybe we should use our energy to better educate our children, and perhaps if we better educate our children in the ways of God, we won't have to have this war at the end of days. So this is something that the Talmud tells us. So whether this war happens or it does not happen, it's unclear. Many people have, throughout the ages, have pointed to some of the wars that were happening and said, oh, this must be the war of the Gog and Magog, which means Moshiach is here any moment. So perhaps it was, perhaps it wasn't. But this is just another prophecy. It talks about the war of Gog and Magog. Give me a second. That is point number 6. Let's move on to point number 7. Again, a lot going on. What's going to be when Moshiach comes? So we mentioned already in lesson 1 about many of the physical blessings that will happen. So you see on page 262, there will be no more war. There will be no more crime. There will be no more poverty. There will be no more scarcity. There'll be no more disabilities, right? These are things that we mentioned in great length in lesson 1. So we'll leave it at that. This is going to be a time where we'll have all that we need physically. Maimonides explains how he always tries to explain things on a more of a natural manner. He says, in other words, what this means is that a minimum of labor will produce tremendous benefit. Now, think about that even today. Compare to when your grandmother was cooking dinner, or your great-grandparents were cooking dinner, to the way we cook dinner, right? How do we cook dinner? We go to the freezer, we find some, frozen French fries. We have some fresh meat or fresh chicken in the fridge or in the freezer. We put it into the pot. It's ready a half hour later, an hour later, we're done. We're ready to sit down to eat. How did this happen in ancient times? You got to go chop wood. You got to heat up the oven. You got to go draw water. You got to go take your chicken and slaughter it and prepare it and salt it, right? It's hours and hours of work just to get a dinner. That takes us today minutes. So even today, we kind of could appreciate the idea of minimum labor produces tremendous benefit. You ever heard of the expression, well, will money grow on trees? Right? It comes from not necessarily this literally, we're just, hey, we have money, we have clothing on the tree. But the point is, it's so simple. Compared to ancient times, it's so simple. Now, take that 10 times fold, 20 times fold. Imagine if whatever it takes us today to prepare a meal, when Mashiach comes, it'll take a fraction of the time. Whether it be new technology or miraculous, we don't know. But that's the idea. That's the way Maimonides interprets a lot of these physical benefits. And he says, why? What is the purpose for these benefits? Ultimately, it will be possible then to observe the entire Torah without worry or fear. Ultimately, Maimonides says the purpose of this all is to help us focus, we have extra time on our hands, so we can do good things, we can study more Torah, we can help other people, we could be free of any worry or stress. Okay, so that is point number 7, which leads us to point number 8. Point number 8 is the resurrection. Jewish. The Torah tells us, we believe, one of the major things, miraculous things that's going to happen when Moshiach comes is the idea of the resurrection of the dead. Okay, now, many people questioned whether Maimonides believes in the resurrection of the dead. They say, hey, Maimonides is trying to interpret everything in the natural manner. Resurrection of the dead, there's no two ways about that. That's obviously miraculous. So Maimonides actually wrote a long letter, as we referenced earlier, that of course, Maimonides believes in the resurrection of the dead. If you remember, when we read in the previous lessons, the 13 principles of faith that Maimonides wrote out, composed, he writes one of the 13 principles of faith is to believe that there will be a time where the dead will be resurrected. So of course he believes in it. What he says is that when there's a necessity, when there's no other way to interpret a prophecy, of course it means miraculous. What Maimonides is saying is that many of their prophecies can also be interpreted that they are going to be natural, and it's okay. It's okay to interpret it that way, but not necessarily is it going to be all natural, though there will be many miraculous things that happens as well. So of course he believes in the resurrection of the dead. The resurrection of the dead is actually hinted to many times throughout the Torah. The Torah says sometimes in futures that things that will happen even to people who passed away. So we understand that it's referring to the resurrection of the dead. And this is something that's going to happen before Moshiach comes or after Moshiach comes. Different opinions exactly when it's going to happen, the order of things, but our parents, our grandparents will return one day when Mashiach comes. Now, what is the purpose of it? Why do we need Tichiyas HaMesim? What's wrong? They lived their life, they passed away. Now let's move on. Why do we need Tichiyas HaMesim? Why do we need this resurrection of the dead? So the basic understanding is that it's a reward, right? We worked hard. Our bodies and souls together. So we want to be rewarded. So we have our soul being rewarded up in heaven. But ultimately, we want to have this reward with our body. So we come back here in a body and we enjoy the fruits of our labor. But to take this a step further, and based on what we explained in the previous lessons about the purpose of it all, what is the purpose of creation? Is the purpose of creation up in heaven, or is the purpose of creation down below? So we explained that the purpose of creation is down below, not up in heaven. So a person lives 120 years, they pass away, their soul goes up to heaven, which is great. But this person played an active role in bringing the world to its state of divine reality, to the Messianic Era. Why should this person lose out in having, seeing the fruits of his labor down here where it counts most? Right? We explained in I think in the previous course that up in heaven is more pleasurable for the soul. It's in a spiritual state. It feels at home. It loves it. Very pleasurable. We go on vacation. We go to Florida. We go to California. We're on the beach. Very, very pleasurable. But we all know that's not the purpose of it all. The purpose of life is not just to enjoy it. Of course, to enjoy it, but the purpose isn't just to relax and have a great time. The purpose is to be productive, to accomplish things. So yes, we do need those breaks. We need time out, and it's good to have time to relax and to enjoy ourselves. But ultimately, we understand that we can't just do this all day in, day out. We got to get back to work. We got to get back to life, right? So ultimately, the soul is has more pleasure up in heaven, but ultimately it accomplishes more down below. So if it wants to be responsible, and it wants to be down here. So the soul lives a life does its thing, accomplishes great accomplishments, goes to heaven, and it receives a reward in heaven, but ultimately, it really wants to come back down here to live the purpose of it all, to live the ultimate life where it counts most is when it lives down here. This is the purpose. This is why God created heaven and earth, that souls in bodies should do their thing, right? Should live life. So that's why, even though, throughout the ages, people passed away, generation after generation, but because collectively everyone was involved in making this world a better place, so everyone's going to come back to enjoy the purpose of creation. So that is the reason why one of the reasons given why there will be the resurrection of the dead, because we don't see this as, you're in a better place. You were, finally you made it to heaven. Now is where you made it. Now is where you are finally at rest. No. You're there temporarily. The person is there temporarily, but ultimately, the purpose of it all is for it to return back to planet Earth. Because here is really where it counts most. Here's really where all. So that is the reason given for the resurrection of the dead. So just to summarize. So we said, just kind of to understand a general picture of what's going to be when Moshiach comes. We spoke about 8 or 9 different points over here. We spoke about that generally Maimonides talks about that most things very possibly will be on a natural miracle, meaning a miracle that perhaps is not probable, but it is possible. It's not breaking nature unless there's no other way to interpret like the resurrection of the dead. So that is one understanding of what will be when Moshiach comes. Just to add quickly, some explain, the Rebbe actually in the talk once explained that there will be perhaps 2 stages in the era of Moshiach. And the first stage of Moshiach, everything will be more natural. And the second stage of Moshiach, that is where it will be a lot more miraculous. So perhaps the lion and the leopard, the wolf and the leopard lying with the lamb and the goat, perhaps in the first stage of the era of Moshiach, that will be more like an allegory, like a parable of the nations of the world that want to devour us will live side by side in peace. But the second stage of the Messianic era, then it will be literal, where the nature of animals will change and many of the other miracles will play out in an actual miraculous manner. So that was point number 1. Point number 2, we spoke about the Jewish and the Gentiles relationship. Point number 3, we talk about the significance of the building the third temple in Jerusalem. We spoke about the ingathering of all the exiles, and that the cause of the ingathering is not only because to flee persecution, but because they recognize the beauty of Israel, the beauty of the temple, and the divinity of it all. We talk about the restoration of many of the mitzvos through the reinstatement of the Sanhedrin. We spoke about the war of the Armageddon, the Gog and Magog war. We spoke about the physical blessings that will be the no illness and the no famine and the no war and all that. And how Maimonides explains that this is all in order to give us extra time, and we don't have extra mind space to be able to focus on doing goodness and kindness and the study of Torah, etc. And we spoke about the resurrection of the dead. So these are many, many ideas that we spoke about what will be when Mashiach comes. And I want to conclude with one powerful text 14, which talks about what should we do today? What do we do today to make this all happen? And ultimately, we believe it's not a one-man person, it's not a one-man band, it's not just each person doing it on their own, it's collectively, everyone together, but each individual makes a big difference. They say the story of an out-of-towner that drove his car into a ditch in an area he didn't recognize, and he's stuck. His car is in a ditch. So a local comes by, local farmer, and he has this big dog with him, and the dog's name is Buddy. And he says, but he tells the dog, and he calls the dog by a different name. It says, "Hey, Sammy, pull the car out." Sammy doesn't move. So he says, "Hey, Nully, pull the car out." Buddy doesn't move. He says, hey, whatever, a different name, right? Pull the car out. Bobby doesn't move. Finally, he called the dog by its name. Hey, Buddy, pull the car out. And like that, Buddy pulls the car out. So the car owner turns to the farmer and says, if his name is Buddy, why are you calling him all these other names? Of course he's not going to listen. He said, listen, my dog is blind. The only way he's going to pull the car out, he's even going to try to pull the car out, is only if he thinks that there are other dogs with him doing it. The point is that we're all in it together. It's not just us. It's Tom, and it's Franny, it's Michael, it's Diane, it's Lynn, it's Ivan, it's Mendel, it's everyone together. Each and every one of us we have to contribute our part. But ultimately, it might just take one of us, one last good deed to really make a difference. I want to read text 14 on page 270. You should view yourself at all times as equally balanced with merits and faults, and view the world similarly, equally balanced with merits and faults. Therefore, if you perform one mitzvah, you tip the balance, your own and that of all of humankind, and effect personal and global deliverance and salvation. You see the world like an equal scale, right? Two cups on the side, two weights, and it's exactly even. You see yourself that way, you see the world over that way. And what do you need? One last little mitzvah. You take a little quarter and you put it into the charity box. That little quarter might tip the scale, not just a drop. It tips the scale for you and for the entire world. And that's it. And Moshiach comes. That one little phone call that you make and say, hey, I'm just thinking about you. How are you doing? What can I do for you? Do you want to visit? That one tefillin that someone puts on, that one Shabbos candles. Maybe this week I'll skip. No, I'll strike that match. I'll light the Shabbos candles before sundown on Friday evening. Or one little good deed that we do. One act of goodness and kindness. It could be tiny in our eyes. But that might just be the last one that's needed to bring Moshiach. That, Maimonides tells us, is how we should view ourselves every single day. Today might be the day that scale is equal, and we just need to tip the scale. That, my friends, is the conclusion of this lesson 6 of This Can Happen. It was a pleasure spending 6 weeks with you. Thank you so much for joining us. Please stay tuned for further JLI courses. Generally, we don't do a JLI course per se during the summer. The next one is usually like in November or so. So please stay tuned. However, I generally do a summer class or even 2 summer classes. I have not fully confirmed, fully decided what the topic will be. It probably will not be in the month of June. I'm looking more like in the month of July or August. And stay tuned. We'll do some classes, God willing, in those weeks. If you have any specific topic that you would like to see covered, please let me know. Either I could give a class on it or I can't, but it doesn't hurt to try. So I'd love to hear back from you if you have a specific topic so we can know what the interest is. But either way, thank you all for joining. If you have any questions or comments, please share with me. All the best.